to our next Life Sciences revision lesson for grade 12s. And in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the human nervous system. First of all, what is the nervous system made of? And the nervous system is made of millions of nerve cells, which are called neurons. Let's have a look at what a neuron looks like. Okay, so we're looking at nerve cells or neurons, and they are very, very specialized cells because they have to be able to conduct nerve impulses all over our body to enable us to react to what is happening in our surroundings. So, let's have a look at what they have. Nerve cells have got dendrites, which pick up nerve impulses from other nerve cells. They then have a cell body, and the cytoplasm in the cell body is gray, and that is why sometimes you hear people talking about the gray matter upstairs, which means your brain, and it's basically referring to the cell bodies. Then this, very important, because that is the axon, and the axon is what transmits nerve impulses. And to make sure the nerve impulses get transmitted along the correct axons to the correct muscle, they have an insulating layer of myelin, which is a fatty substance, and surrounding the myelin is a layer of cells as an extra insulating layer, and where the cells join next to each other, there are nodes which are called nodes of Ranvier. And basically what happens is the impulse comes here and it gets carried all the way along the neuron until it gets to the terminal branches at the end of the neuron, and that is when it is passed on to a muscle or when it is passed on to another neuron. There are different types of neurons, and you should have done some of these in class. We can classify them or group them according to what their function is or what they look like, and we're going to have a look at them in connection with what are their functions. First of all, you have a sensory neuron, and that looks a bit like this. It's got its cell body in the middle of the neuron, and that is also sometimes called a unipolar neuron. This takes messages from sense organs all the way to your spinal cord. Then the other types of neurons, we find motor neurons, and those look like this. They have a cell body at one end with a whole lot of dendrites, and then an axon along which the nerve impulse is transmitted. We also sometimes have interneurons, and those are neurons that connect motor and sensory neurons. The most common type of neuron is this one here, because that is what makes up most of your brain. And the reason why it does, you see all these little dendrites. Whenever you think, messages get sent through all these dendrites, and that is what enables you to think, that is what enables you to learn. It's the multipolar neurons which are found in your brain. Now, what is the difference between a neuron and a nerve? Because I'm sure you've heard talk about nerves. Neurons are tiny, tiny little cells. Nerves, if you cut yourself, you can actually see a nerve. And a nerve is composed of many neurons. And this is an enlarged picture, and each of those little dots would be a cut-off axon of a neuron. And you can see there are quite a lot of them. Some of them are taking impulses from the skin to the brain and spinal cord, and others are carrying messages to the muscles. So in a nerve, there's generally two-way traffic. For example, in your arm, there's a nerve here, and it will carry messages from your skin to your spinal cord and from your brain to your muscles, so you know that you must move your arm. Next, what is an impulse? It's a very complex electrical activity which passes from dendrite, cell body, all the way along the axon, and then it passes on to the next nerve. Problem is that there's a tiny, tiny little gap between one nerve and the next, and that is called a synapse. One would think that if a nerve impulse is electricity, there would be a little spark jumping, but no, there are no sparks jumping in your brain. The way the impulse gets across the gap is by chemicals, and these chemicals are called neurotransmitters. And when the impulse arrives, these little vesicles release the chemicals diffuse across the gap, and when they get to the next neuron, they actually start an impulse. Now, let's have a look at how a whole lot of neurons, millions of them, are actually put together to form our nervous system. So, our nervous system is composed of two basic parts: central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And we are going to be looking at each one of these. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system takes messages to your muscles. We were talking about how your arm now knows to move, but there's also an extra automatic nervous system which basically makes sure you stay alive, and that's called the autonomic nervous system. We're going to be having a look at some of these different parts. First of all, central nervous system, that's here, that's your brain and spinal cord, and that is where the mass of your neurons actually are. Then, connecting the spinal cord to your hands, the muscles in your arms, and the rest of your body, we have the peripheral nervous system. Periphery means on the outside. So, let's first have a look at the brain and then the spinal cord, because these are the ones that actually do the work of your thinking. The peripheral nervous system is simply like an electrical wire. It's taking an impulse to a particular place. Your brain and spinal cord are where the magic of your nervous system happens. First of all, your brain is like jelly. And it's very important jelly, so it has to be well protected. So it's protected by the skull, which is hard, 3 membranes or meninges, which are quite tough to prevent bacteria and things like that getting into the brain. And then lastly, between the membranes is a liquid called the cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid actually acts as a cushion. So if somebody hits you on the head, you don't actually damage these soft brain cells. What does the brain look like? First of all, if you look at the brain, it has 2 halves or hemispheres. And when you look at the brain, it will appear a pinkish grayish color because gray matter, which is the cell bodies of the neurons, form the outside of the brain, and there are all these folds, and the folds are there so you can fit more of these very important neurons into your brain. You can also see, this is looking from the back, you can see that the brain is divided into 2 halves or hemispheres of the brain, the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. Then, they're also divided into this big part, which is the cerebrum, which does our thinking. That's where our awareness, our sensitivity, our ability to think, our imagination, they're all in the cerebrum. Then tucked away at the bottom is the cerebellum, and the cerebellum is basically our coordinator of our movement. It stops us falling flat on our faces. Then this bit at the bottom here very important. That is the medulla, and that is the one that keeps us breathing and keeps our heart beating. Let's have a look at what's inside the brain. We've already seen that's the cerebrum, and that's the cerebellum, and the medulla is that part, just where the spinal cord joins to the brain. But there are also other interesting parts inside the brain. There's something called the hypothalamus here, and what that does is it controls your blood pressure, body temperature, and metabolic processes that you need to actually keep you alive. The next one is the corpus callosum, which is that part there, and that is a layer of white matter, which is the axons, and that joins the left and right hemispheres together. And whenever you practice anything that involves coordination, you are improving the ability of the corpus callosum to pass messages from one half of the brain to the other. Then, this little thing here is the pituitary gland, and I'm not going to mention much about that, is because you're going to be looking at that later on when we do the endocrine system. I think by now your brains are quite boggled, so before we carry on with the spinal cord, let's take a break. Welcome back, and I hope your neurons enjoyed the break and they are ready to start sending those electrical impulses again. What we're going to look at now is we're going to have a look at the spinal cord. And what the spinal cord is, it's a passage taking nerve impulses from the body to the brain and from the brain to the body. So it's basically a conductor. It's found inside the vertebrae, and if you cut open the spinal cord, this is what you can see. On the outside is the white matter. Remember, the white matter is the axons of the neurons. In the center, you find an H or a butterfly shape of gray matter, and the gray matter is the cell bodies of the neurons. Then, the spinal cord takes messages to parts of the body and receives messages from parts of the body. So, between the vertebrae, you will find spinal nerves entering and leaving the spinal cord. But they don't do that in an ordinary way, because as the spinal nerve gets to the spinal cord, it divides into two parts, which we call roots. The part closest to the back of your body is called the dorsal root, and the part closest to the front of your body is called the ventral root. And the easy way to think of this is to think of the spinal cord like a freeway, a 10-lane freeway. And the spinal nerve is like a road which comes from another town. And in the spinal nerve, there's two-way traffic. And when you get to the freeway, if you want to go on the freeway, you go on the on-ramp. Okay, and that's what the dorsal root is like. The dorsal root is like the on-ramp onto a freeway because it takes impulses into the spinal cord. The ventral root is like the off-ramp because that is where the messages from the brain pass out of the spinal cord to the spinal nerve, and they would then go on their way to that particular muscle in the body. Now, if we have a look at this picture, that just shows all of those things. Those are the neurons leaving the spinal cord, joining to the spinal nerve. That's your dorsal root. And the way you can tell which is the dorsal root and which is the ventral root is the dorsal root always has a little swelling on it. And the swelling is where the cell bodies of the unipolar or sensory neurons are actually located. So that's why you shouldn't get confused between what is a dorsal root and what is a ventral root. Now, most of the time, the spinal cord simply acts as a passage, a highway sending messages to and from the brain. But every now and again, the spinal cord does something special by itself. Now, in a normal situation, you would touch something, the message would go along the nerve, through the spinal cord to the brain would decide what to do, and you would move your hand. However, if there is danger involved, then the spinal cord doesn't ask the brain for advice. The spinal cord immediately sends out a message to the muscle to move your hand away from whatever potential damage there is. So let's have a look. There's the stimulus, which in this case is heat. A sense receptor in your skin senses the heat. It passes along a sensory neuron up the arm and past the cell body into the spinal cord. And the spinal cord immediately, by means of a connector neuron, immediately sends a message to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron sends a message to the muscle. And at the same time, you realize your arm has moved. That's when you realize, oh, my arm moved because it was hot, because the message gets to the muscle at the same time it actually gets to the brain. Because in a dangerous situation, even a fraction of a second can make a big difference between your skin being burnt off and just having a couple of blisters. So reflex actions are designed to protect your body. Now, we're going to look at the peripheral nervous system. There's the brain at the top, and here's the spinal cord, and you can see all of these are your spinal nerves leaving the brain. And the reason why there's a gap between them is that is where the bone of the vertebral column is. So these all go off to different parts of your body, and they also bring messages from different parts of your body. Now, the part of the peripheral nervous system that we've been talking about is the somatic nervous system. And that's the part we are aware of. That goes to our muscles, and that links our spinal cord to our senses. So that's for voluntary actions. But in addition, we have what we call the autonomic nervous system. And the best way to think of this is it's an automatic nervous system. And that controls involuntary actions. For example, peristalsis in your body, your heartbeat. And if you can think of this as the automatic nervous system, it will help you remember. And it's got to be automatic because, quite honestly, if we had to concentrate on making our heart beat, we would probably forget to do so. So it's just as well we have an automatic nervous system that does that for us. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system prepares your body for action. So, if you've got a fright, your sympathetic nervous system will send a message to your heart, and your heart will start beating faster. It will send a message to your lungs, and you will start breathing faster. Why? So that oxygen can get to your muscles, so you can run away. That might save your life. But once the emergency is over, your heart's got to slow down. And that's the job of the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the chill nervous system. Hey guys, cool it, slow down, don't get hassled. and that brings your body back to its normal state. So what these two systems do, they act antagonistically, which means they work against each other. It's to prepare your body for emergencies and then relax when the emergency is over. Now, we're going to have a look at some of our sense organs. First of all, the ear. And you should know the ear consists of the outer ear, the middle ear, which is here, and the inner ear, which is this part. And each part of the ear has a very important role to play. The outer ear basically acts as a funnel for sound waves to go down into and to touch the tympanic membrane or eardrum, and the eardrum will vibrate. And when it vibrates, there are three little bones called the ossicles, or the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, and they will also vibrate. And important is they amplify the vibration, so they make your hearing clearer. The vibration is then passed into the inner ear, and the inner ear is filled with liquid, and the liquid vibrates. That is what enables us to hear. So, if we have a look at this diagram, it shows us sound waves coming in, eardrum or tympanic membrane vibrating, hammer, anvil, and stirrup vibrating, the stirrup vibrating and passing the vibrations through the oval window into the liquid in the cochlea, because the cochlea is the part of the inner ear that actually does our hearing for us. And depending on the pitch of the sound, the vibration will stimulate a little organ called the organ of Corti in some part of the cochlea. And different parts of the cochlea are stimulated by different pitch sounds. High-pitched or low-pitched sounds are heard in different areas of the cochlea. Then, the ear also does our balance for us, and it looks at two things: head movement, and the semicircular canals, they sense head movement. They've got a little cone they've got a swelling at each end or at one end, and inside the swelling is a little cone of jelly, and as you move your head from side to side, the liquid moves and it causes this cone of jelly to tilt, and embedded in the cone of jelly are nerves, and they send a message to your brain, and that's how you know your head is moving, even if your eyes are closed. Then, also in the inner ear, you can perceive the direction of gravity, and that is the position of the head relative to gravity, and that occurs in something called the macula, which has got little stones on it which respond to gravity, and when you tilt your head, gravity pulls on the tiny microscopic stones, it tilts the nerve cells, and they then send a message to the brain telling you this is down. I hope that has helped your understanding.